We're going to have fun today looking at this last of the Oldsmobile land yachts from 1981, and that is this navy blue over cream Oldsmobile 98 Coupe, a very unique color combination. And as I said, this was really the end of the run for the Oldsmobile land yachts. The last year for the 98, I'll call it the full-size 98 that you see here, rear-wheel drive, and just a massive vehicle, was 1984. In 1985, it would transition to front-wheel drive and be downsized quite significantly. So this is the last of the big 98s that ran from 1977 to 1984. The Delta 88 would get one more model year as a big rear-wheel drive car. 1985, the Olds 98 would be front-wheel drive. The Delta 88 would go front-wheel drive in 1986. And that made sense because you want to make sure that you're starting the new trend with a more expensive vehicle, which obviously was the 98 over the 88. Now, by this point, the 98 of this body style was kind of partway through its mid-year run, and it looked pretty similar from 1981, really 1980, all the way through to its finish in 1984. Up front, you have this handsome but very boxy front end. Of course, you have the headlamps, the steel beam headlamps that are squares, and 4 of those, a quad headlamp setup. Then you have the grille, which is really egg crate within an egg crate to give it some texture. Of course, egg crates were always synonymous with Oldsmobile 98s, that egg crate grille texture. I don't quite know why, but for some reason, egg crate grille texture generally connoted luxury. And so the Oldsmobile 98s for many years had it, including this 1981 model. And of course, the overall styling, this was the so-called sheer look styling era from General Motors, where they were trying to deviate from the more rounded, bulbous forms of the 1971 to 76 models. And when these came out in 1977, they were much more trim and lean. And again, GM's design Vice President Bill Mitchell called these the sheer look cars. Now, as we transition to the side view, we see just how cool this cream and navy blue color combination is. I don't think I've ever seen another Olds 98 with this particular color combination. And you can also see how big this car still is, despite the fact that it was downsized. This car rides atop 119-inch wheelbase, is 221 inches in overall length. So it's still massive. I mean, look at that rear overhang from the center line of the rear wheel out to the edge of the back bumper. Just huge. And this particular view also shows off some traits of GM styling that would continue on even in the front-wheel drive generation. Notice the first thing, you have this lead-in from the front edge of the hood or the front edge of the car all the way up to the windshield. You have kind of a soft taper from the windshield down to that edge of the hood. In other words, the side section is getting narrower and narrower. And you have the same, a very gentle taper from the backlight to the end of the rear deck there. So this was something that GM did different than Ford of the era. Like if you look at the mid-80s town car, the quarter and the fender are pretty much flat. Here you have at least this kind of gentle taper front and rear that was very characteristic of GM vehicles. In years prior, they would even have a more pronounced taper. But by this point, they really didn't. They were becoming a bit more boxy. You also have the belt line that you can see there below the fender. Notice that the belt line on this particular vehicle, in particular at the front edge of the door, kind of skives downward and then creates more glass area to give the passengers inside a feeling of greater interior space. That styling trait would, again, continue on the front-wheel drive vehicles for GM. Then you have this relatively chunky and vertical C-pillar a la 1976 to 79 Seville. And then you also have a deck lid that's relatively high, kind of pinching that backlight a little bit. Again, something that you'd see on the front-wheel drive cars. And that was purposeful. When General Motors transitioned to front-wheel drive, they had a different philosophy as opposed to Ford with the 1986 Taurus, and they wanted their smaller front-wheel drive vehicles to still kind of look like these old-school vehicles. And to be honest, it was a pretty successful philosophy. The Olds 98, when it was downsized for the 1985 model year, was actually the best-selling Olds 98 to date by a pretty large margin. Sold, I believe, 180,000 units in the 1985 model year alone. Now, the 1985 model year was an extended model year, but still, I think it began in about March of 1984. And even if you kind of cut that number by 20%, 25%, it still was a record year for the Olds 98. So it really was a great philosophy, but you notice a number, like I said, of the styling cues here on this Olds 98 really set up those front-wheel drive cars as well. Now, one thing that you didn't get on the front-wheel drive Olds 98 was the fender skirt that you can see here is pretty pronounced. And, I really like the fender skirts, but they had the full open wheel on the front-wheel drive Olds 98, and I think that was probably the better choice. On this particular car, the fender skirt does give the rear a little bit, maybe too much bulk, but it doesn't look bad, and I think it looks good overall. But aside from that fender skirt, imagine for a moment that body side molding and the door edge guard were not on this car. The side section of the car is just very clean and simple. There's really nothing overall to speak of in terms of the styling. It's pretty plain. You have this slight feature line that runs the length of the car up top, but that's about it. And that described the sheer look styling era of GM. You know what? These cars sold well, and I think they look pretty good, although we'll talk a little bit more about why I don't own one of these. I'm a big block fan. I love cars with big blocks, and by 1981, well, let's just say there wasn't a big block under hood, either standard or available. We'll talk about the powertrains in a second. Now, out back, we have the Olds 98's very typical vertical tail lamps. This would be a signature of the Olds 98 dating all the way back to 1963, and it would continue on all the way till the last of the Oldsmobile 98s as well. And that was really to emulate Cadillac, emulate that upper end kind of trade, at least from the rear, to have that vertical lamp signature. Oldsmobile always had kind of very functional graphics on their cars, and the tail lamps were, big rectangles or blocks, and you can see here that it's very similar. Cadillac often had the tail lamps jazzed up a little bit, but not Oldsmobile. Again, very functional lighting on Oldsmobiles was often the norm. Same with the reverse lights. That's a pretty big reverse light area there underneath the deck lid. I guess they wanted to make sure that people knew you were reversing. I do like how the filler panel around the bumper, between the bumper and the reverse lights and the tail lamps, is the cream color and not the navy blue. And, of course, this car has the obligatory for the era vinyl top on it. And it's kind of the have-to-pay vinyl top. Not my favorite style. I don't mind full vinyl tops, but the have-to-pay where it just kind of looks like it's sliding back on the roof panel is admittedly not my favorite. What I do like, though, is how the tail lamps, if you look at the form of the quarter panel, at the top of the quarter panel, it's almost like they got pulled from the center of the car all the way back, and they created that little surface on the top of the quarter panel with the flat portion up top. I thought that was kind of a cool look overall. Now let's turn to the interior of this Olds 98, because this is really the exciting part, and that's because of these beautiful loose cushion style seats. These would be introduced by Oldsmobile beginning in the 1972 model year on the 1972 Oldsmobile 98 Regency, and I guess customers loved them so much that Oldsmobile just kept producing them, even on the front-wheel drive cars. So here you have those loose cushion seats with kind of a diamond pattern, I guess, to the cloth. It looks fantastic. Now, unfortunately, they're not quite as comfortable as they look. I would say they're more comfortable than cars today, but they could have done a little bit better job, although by this point they are getting a little bit more comfy. Those first seats in the 1972 Oldsmobile 98 Regencies looked a lot more comfortable than they really were. Now, of course, it's an 80s era General Motors car, and that means lots of fake wood grain. So you have to have the top of the door panel have fake wood grain, the casket-style door handle or the door pull has fake wood grain, and then the armrest also has some fake wood grain along with the steering wheel. And you know what? It looks tasteful and rich. I have to say overall that these cars really did have the last of kind of the old school interior design with this fake wood grain. You would get fake wood grain on some cars going on to the future, but the poofy seats, the thick door panels, the thickly padded armrests like you see here, I think that this is just something that's missing in cars today, especially because you get all different interior colors too in your car back then, including the headliner. Now, if they do different color interiors, they often have the headliner and the A-pillar trim is the same color. Now let's take a look at the door panel, and you can see the full width armrest, just an absolutely huge armrest, that fake wood grain I was mentioning. Here, somebody has monogrammed even that fake wood grain. I guess they wanted to mark that this was their Olds 98. Now, the one thing that looks a bit strange to me is that casket handle door pull looks a little small relative to the size of the door panel, because the door panel is just so gosh darn huge. But you do still have real kind of metal door handles and nice metal switch trim. And this car, you can see it on the other side of the window glass. It has the optional outside temperature thermometer. That would just spin, and there's a red line on it, so you can read the outside temperature from inside the vehicle. And that was also illuminated at night. Quite a neat little feature. Now let's transition under hood in this particular Olds 98. And this explains a bit why I'm a little bit lukewarm on these cars. Not because the engines were bad. Well, one of them we'll talk about was not a great engine. But two of the three were pretty good overall. This car has the optional Olds 307 5-liter V8. You can tell it's an Oldsmobile engine by that oil fill cap there in the front of the motor. That was something that no other GM V8s had at this time. Other GM V8s previous did, including some Chevrolet V8s, but not by this point in the early 1980s. And this engine, the top optional engine in this Olds 98, made 145 horsepower, the best engine you could get. And, the Olds 307s in these earlier years were better than the later ones. But still, trying to propel a car that's 221 inches long with 145 horsepower, it was fine if you're just driving it normally. But if you floor these, they really don't have much scoot. And there's not a heck of a lot of torque. I think around 240 pound-feet, so it's not even in the high 200s. So they don't really have all that much torque. They do have a 4-speed automatic transmission with overdrive. They do get relatively good gas mileage. On the freeway, let's say 21, 22, maybe 23, depending upon how fast you're going. Although because of the lack of torque, if you start going up hills, the transmission often hunts between overdrive and drive. This car is fully equipped under hood. You can see the automatic suspension leveler there on the driver's side, and it also has cruise control. Now, the Olds 307 was the most powerful engine. What actually came standard for 1981 under hood was a Buick-sourced 4.1-liter V6 engine. It made 125 horsepower and 205 pound-feet of torque. This would be the same engine that was really, it was based on the Buick 3.8-liter V6, which would later become the venerable 3800. But at this point, it was still the, I'll call it, odd-firing V6. It had a little bit of the shakes because it was a 90-degree V6 versus a 60-degree V6. Buick had done some things to try to make it even-firing. But, the 4.1-liter V6 was just not that powerful overall. Like I said, 125 horsepower. And then the worst engine that you could get in your 81 Olds 98 was the 5.7-liter, the largest displacement, Oldsmobile diesel, 350 cubic inch diesel, making 105 horsepower and 200 pound-feet of torque. By this point, though, the diesels actually were pretty good. They had the revised block, and they were becoming more reliable. But unfortunately, with the introduction of them in 1978 and the failures that many people experienced, buyers were starting to eschew diesels. They just didn't want the reliability problems. They didn't want the stink and the noise and the clatter. But the Olds diesels of this era, if you had it in one of these cars, did get good fuel mileage, 25 to 27 miles per gallon freeway. They just had no power at all, 105 horsepower, again, in a pretty heavy car. I had an Olds diesel in my 1979 Cadillac Seville, which was a smaller car physically, about the same weight, maybe even a little bit more, shockingly, than this Olds 98. And I just remember if I wanted to pass somebody on a 2-lane road, I had to drop back and floor it and gain some speed before I would overtake them. But it did get good fuel mileage. I'll give it that. So you did have the full-size car comfort, or in that case, the international-size car comfort with all the power of the diesel. So what do you think about this Olds 98, the last of the land yachts, last of the behemoths from Oldsmobile? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Thanks again for watching.